All right, good afternoon, all. Again, I am Justin Carter. I am teaching the micro and macroeconomics courses. Chapters 1 through 4, I believe, in the textbooks are identical. In the two textbooks, we're just building a foundation of definitions and terminology and basic concepts. So, for both courses, the first few lectures will be identical. So we're going to dive right in. Chapter 1. What is economics and why is it important? I'm going to kind of go through my notes here. And these first few chapters are really, really simplistic and are basically just definitions. So these lectures will not be long. For your exams, just really, I would suggest understand the definitions, understand the basic diagrammatic concepts. We'll get into some of that, like the supply and demand curves, the sort of circular flow diagram you find in this first chapter, this sort of thing. So, all right, we're going to dive right in. In section 1.1 is what is economics and why is it important? They discuss the division of labor, why the division of labor is so important in the modern economy. Under traditional economics, there was very little division of labor, right? Generally, it was subsistence farming. Everyone had basically the same job. Everyone was a farmer or worked the land or something in some sense. There was a small segment of society which were elitists or which were sort of mercantilists. But for the most part, the vast majority of economic life before the Industrial Revolution basically was subsistence farming. And everyone did the same thing, right? Everyone fixed their own bed. Everyone made their own table and chairs. Everyone, you didn't really buy things, right? You grew your own food. You canned it. You lived till the next year, and you could grow your food again. It was a pretty brutal, simplistic society. The Industrial Revolution brought about the division of labor. It brought about expertise. It brought about the idea of teaching individuals to do very, very simplistic, repetitive tasks so that you could create efficiencies. So you get specialization of labors. And the whole reason for this is efficiency. You want to be able to make more products in a shorter amount of time with fewer inputs, this sort of thing. So it allows workers to focus. It also allows greater expertise, right? If you're the guy who whittles down the end of the rod for whatever, it's best that eventually, after the 1,000th whittle of the rod, I mean, you're going to be pretty darn good at this, and so you become an expert at rod whittling, right? So you're not doing every single minute task in, say, building a dreidel or a top or something of that sort, right? That way you become highly efficient in your very, very repetitive task, and everyone else is highly efficient in their very repetitive task. And so it doesn't actually take 40 minutes to build a top. You can build 1,000 tops in 40 minutes if you have the right people who have these extremely efficient tasks, right? And you also get economy of scale. This is how the modern society runs. This is the whole idea of logistics networks, is the economy of scale. You want to be able to purchase the most input at the very lowest price in the expectation that you're going to make a whole lot of product. And that you can capitalize on the profit of each individual product. But because you bought so much input, you reduce the price of the input, which allows you to make product at a better profit. Right. So these are the three things basically: specialization, higher quality efficiency, and the economy of scale. For anyone who's interested in sort of the birth of economics, at least the birth of the modern economic theory and philosophy, I would suggest that you read Adam Smith's A Wealth of Nations. It's a hard read. I'll tell you that. A lot of economics texts are difficult reads, especially in modern day economics, because a lot of it is based um, on logical modeling. And it's very difficult to sort of get through the logical modeling logic and how the puzzle actually works. So if you want to go further in economics, I would say it's really difficult reading. So work on your reading comprehension. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. We're going to move on to the next section, macro and microeconomics. Later in the book, we're going to talk about the differences between monetary and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is tax and spend. These are basically government policies that the legislature enacts. I guess sometimes, occasionally, the executive, but the legislature enacts these tax and spend policies. Here's how much you owe me if you make a certain amount of money. I shouldn't even say owe me. Here's how much you owe the society in your tax base. And then here, out of that tax base, these are the things that we're going to purchase. And economics is about scarcity at all times, right? The government can't have all of your money. The government doesn't have an infinite supply of money. Individuals don't have an infinite supply of money. So in a sense, we have infinite demand, right? Everyone wants everything, basically. I mean, if you could have it, you would have it. But supply is limited. And so this is the beauty of economics, I guess, is how do we decide out of these infinite number of decisions and things that we want, how do we set the policy? Do we build a new warship, or do we help to feed the needy? Do we build new tanks, or do we increase our expenditures per pupil in, let's say, elementary education? I mean, there are literally probably a million things that you could spend this money on. So that's the difficulty of economics: is what are we going to spend it on? So fiscal policy is about the government. How do we tax and spend? Monetary policy is about the money in the system. What are banking interest rates? What are the banking policies? What are the interest rates on lending? What is your return on, say, government bonds? How much money are we going to pump into the system? All of these different things. How much is the Treasury going to print, even? So very, very different. They can often have similar effects, but they're very different things. The monetary side of things is supposedly separate from the government. It is good to have an arguably, how do I phrase this? It's good to have a monetary system and a central banking system that isn't beholden to political leaders, right? Because political leaders aren't always looking to do the right thing in the long term. They often have very myopic short-term vision. And so separating the banking system and the Treasury and these sorts of things from the ability of legislators or even the president to affect things like interest rates or the money supply is arguably a good thing, right? For them to have some sort of central bank independence. So we'll talk about all of this sort of monetary and fiscal policy in the future. Again, these first couple chapters are very introductory, so we're going to talk a lot of just terminology. Theories and models. So we should talk a little bit about theories versus models, right? Models are not the real world. Models are a way for us to wrap our minds around simplifications and conceptifications and theorizations of how the real world works. And so, yes, there are problems with economic and political science and scientific and virologist, and I mean, any model you can imagine, there are problems with it, right? Because models are necessarily not to the real world. They are a simplification. But that doesn't mean that you can just dismiss them out of hand, right? We do have scientific knowledge. We do have scientific learning. And we do learn things from data and from simplifications. So don't ever just dismiss models. Understand that they have weaknesses. Understand that they are simplifications of real-world applications. But don't just dismiss them out of hand. So I thought we should at least get that out there. There's been some really... The world in the news and the idea of science is in really weird places these days. So I thought we should at least just approach the idea that you can't just dismiss science altogether. There are problems with it, and there are ways that we can improve it. So I guess we'll leave it there. Next section, how to organize economies. This is just a very simple explanation of the types of economies and even almost an evolution of economics over time. So we start with traditional economies. It says in the book that they organize the way that they always have done, generally around families and farming. It's very, very inefficient. It is often you're living at a subsistence level. If you think about Maslow's sort of hierarchy of needs, it's really hard to move up the ladder toward culture and self-actualization and knowledge and these sorts of things that can improve a society and an individual's life. You're stuck at the base of the pyramid, basically, if you think about the hierarchy of needs. You're stuck just trying to survive. And it's very difficult. It's a life filled with disease and often hunger and things of this sort. So as terrible as, or as many problems as the Industrial Revolution has brought upon the world, it has also sort of pulled us up out of that destitute poverty for most people on Earth, which is how society was structured basically before the Industrial Revolution and before these new efficiencies and trade and things of this sort. There are two types of modern economies, basically. You have a command economy, which is arguably North Korea or the former USSR. Venezuela sort of falls into this realm because Venezuela is deciding how much goods cost. They're deciding what will be produced and what will not. They decide who gets what. So there's no real demand or supply structure in the economy. There's no natural, what they call the invisible hand of the economy sort of deciding what is supplied and at what prices, etc. So, for the most part, as we've seen, command economies don't really work. They have some serious problems that we'll talk about later in the semester. And that's not to say that free market economies don't have problems also, but it does seem that free market, at least at its core, is far more efficient and better at economics in general than the command economies are. Command economies have serious issues with pricing and demand, and then you get shortages and all kinds of things. So we'll discuss that stuff. Lastly, we have market economies. This would be the more European style, the American style. One last thing I would say is that there's no such thing as a pure market economy, just as there's no such thing as a pure command economy. There's a scale, right? There's always a natural spectrum. I don't want you to think of any of these things as Manichaean, black and white concepts, right? there are differences upon the scale where the more purist command economies would be North Korea, USSR, then you fall in towards sort of Venezuela, and then you have sort of the Vietnams, and then you get more toward the free market side where you have, say, Italy and Greece with this sort of high social safety nets, and then all the way over to, say, America would really be on the far end of the market spectrum. But there's no such thing as a pure anything, right? So please just keep that in mind. We're not talking about pure concepts here. There are, America has so many different command sides of its economy, from anti-poverty programs to the way that we run our nuclear weapons programs. There are lots of command economy things that you could point toward, right? So there's no such thing as pure. Okay, just keep that in mind. And then some other things that we'll talk about later in the semester. We've got globalization. Obviously, this has become sort of a hot button issue in the last, I'd say, 50 to 60 years. We're going to talk about imports and exports and trade and what trade is and tariffs and etc. We're also going to talk about how do we measure economics, right? And I provided an example here of GDP, gross domestic product. How do you actually say that the American economy is $3,273,458,216, right? It's sort of silly, but we also need to try our best to measure things, right? And so we'll talk about how things are measured, some of the issues with measurement, some of the inefficiencies, and some of the ways that we've overcome those inefficiencies over time. So anyway, that's the first chapter. Like I said, it's really simple. Lots of just getting to know the terminology. Have a great day, and I'll have the next one up soon.